Hello and welcome to the first of a series of videos on international relations theory. Now, students sometimes ask me, why do we need theory? What's the point of theory? I don't want to study theory, I just want to get straight on and look at real world global politics. So the purpose of this first video is to try to explain what international relations theory is and why we need theory, what the purpose of theory is.
So those are the two questions that this next section will try to answer. What is international relations theory and why do we need theory? So let's start with a dictionary definition. Theory is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. So that's very important. Theory tries to explain something. A theory is a framework for understanding. It is a framework for explanation. And theory is developed by looking at general principles and trying to extrapolate from those. I'll explain a little bit more as we go along what we mean by that. Now, it's important to clarify at the outset that the term theory has a slightly different meaning in academic usage compared to the way we might use the term in a colloquial usage. So in kind of colloquial language, we might say, oh, I have a theory about this, meaning I have a guess or I have a hypothesis about this. That's not what the term theory means in academic usage. The term theory in scholarly usage does not mean random guesswork. It does not mean an unsupported hypothesis. Rather, theory is a framework for explanation which is developed from observation of the world and is subsequently tested against real-world evidence, i.e. by comparing the theoretical model with further observations. Now, to try to get a handle on what theory is, I'm going to step away from international relations for a few moments, and I'm going to talk instead about one of the most famous theories in science, in the natural sciences, Darwin's theory of evolution. So, the theory of evolution, the story begins in 1840 when a young naturalist called Charles Darwin voyaged to the Pacific aboard HMS Beagle. HMS Beagle was kind of a survey ship. Remember that the Pacific has not been fully explored at this time. And one of the missions of the Royal Navy was to carry out exploration and research. And Darwin was the naturalist on board. His job was to make observations and document and catalogue animal and plant species. Now, when Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands, Darwin made some interesting observations about several species of finches. Now, remember, we said that theory begins with observation of phenomena. This is exactly what Darwin did in the Galapagos Islands. He observed several species of finches. Finches are kind of like small songbirds, if you're not aware of that. So Darwin's observation was that the finches on different islands were all basically similar to one another. So on each of the Galapagos Islands, there was a group of finches, different types of finches. They were all fundamentally similar to one another. They all had the same basic body plan. They were all basically recognizable as belonging to the same group of birds. But they also had important differences. Certain characteristics were different from island to island, and particularly in terms of their beaks. their beaks in particular were quite different depending upon the local food source. So on one island, the main source of food might have been nuts and seeds, and the finches on that island had heavy beaks which were used to crack nuts, which were useful for cracking nuts. On another of the islands, the main food source available was insects, and the finches on that island had kind of beaks which were well designed, well adapted to catching insects. On another island, the main food source was actually nectar from flowers, and on that island, the finches were smaller and they kind of had long, narrow beaks, which would be ideal for drinking nectar out of flowers. So these finches are basically the same body plan, all the same kind of group of birds, but on each island, the local population of finches was adapted to the local food source. And Darwin looked at the similarities as well as the differences, and he concluded that all of these finches must have had a common ancestor. That originally there was just a single type of finch, and when the finches had reached the Galapagos Islands and settled there, over time they had become adapted to the local conditions. Here we see Darwin's original drawings of the different types of finches from different islands. Darwin was apparently a reasonable artist as well as a talented naturalist. But we can see in the illustration the different types of beaks possessed by the birds depending on which island they lived on. So Darwin hypothesized that the finches had all developed from a common ancestor, and he made the observation, therefore, that species can change over time, that they can become adapted to local conditions, and that they can change over time. That wasn't Charles Darwin's big contribution to science, because Charles Darwin was not the first to make this observation that species change over time. Charles Darwin's big contribution was in offering an explanation for why this happened. Remember that a theory is a framework for explanation, and that is precisely what Darwin offered. So Darwin came up with the idea of evolution by means of natural selection. And natural selection, as you're probably aware, natural selection works by essentially, it works on the principle that the individuals of a species that are best adapted to survive in particular conditions are the ones which are most likely to pass on their genetics to the next generation, and the ones which are less well adapted are less likely to survive and therefore to breed, and less likely to pass their genetics on. So, for example, on the island where seeds and nuts were the main food source, the individual birds that happened to have the strongest beaks would be the ones most able to crack seeds and nuts, and therefore they were the individuals most likely to survive and to pass on their genetics for strong beaks to the next generation. And the less well adapted ones would simply be less likely to survive and breed. And so you have the big beaked individuals being the ones that survived and bred together, and of their offspring, the ones that had the biggest beaks would be the ones that would be most likely to survive and pass on the genetics, and so on. So over time, the genes for big strong beaks were favoured, with the result that beaks got bigger and stronger and heavier on that island. And of course, the same thing happened on the other islands. So on the island where nectar was the main food source, the birds with the slimmest beaks for dipping into flowers and drinking nectar, those were the ones which were most likely to survive and pass on their genetics. on the island where insects were the main food source, the birds with beaks best suited for catching insects were the ones most likely to pass on their genetics, and so on. So over time, what had begun as a single species of finch with natural variations among individuals developed along different lines, evolved into several different species of finch. So the important point to take away from this is that Darwin developed a framework for explanation of why this happened. He made the observation that these species had changed over time, but he also came up with an explanation for why this happened, and that was Darwin's big contribution to science. Darwin developed a theory, a framework for explanation. Again, the process of building scientific theory is rigorous, and Darwin knew that he needed to make many more observations of many more animal and plant species to see if he could observe evidence for the same phenomenon elsewhere. And it was only after many years of research in 1858 that he finally proposed and published his theory of evolution by natural selection, which is, to a large extent, is the basis of biology today. Almost everything in biology, in a sense, from genetics to classification, cellular biology, all of it kind of is based around the principle, the theory of evolution. It's kind of evolution is kind of the theoretical underpinning of present day understandings of biology. There is no knowable fact without an underlying theory which gives meaning to it. In other words, this is the difference between data and knowledge. Data on its own is simply a collection of facts and figures. Well, facts and figures are important, of course, but on their own, they are not enough, because unless we can understand and interpret what those facts and figures mean, then they aren't necessarily terribly useful, and they aren't the same thing as knowledge. In order to go from raw data to understanding and therefore to knowledge, we need to have an underlying conceptual and underlying theoretical framework which helps us to make sense of what the data is telling us, what the data means. So a fact is an observable phenomenon. A theory is a set of concepts and understandings that explain this observable phenomenon. So, for example, we can say that the sky is blue. Well, in the UK, it's not always blue; it's often grey. But anyway, we can say that the sky is blue. That's just an observation. We can go outside, we can look up into the sky, we can make this observation, but that doesn't really tell us anything. In order to understand why the sky is blue, then we need to be able to apply other known principles. And in this case, we're talking about principles drawn from physics. I'm sure that most of you at school, when you did science at school, you would have done the sort of classical experiment where you pass white light through a prism and the light separates out into a spectrum, different colours of light. We see the same phenomenon in a rainbow, of course. And so once we know that light is made up of a spectrum of different colours, and we understand the principle of refraction, the idea that when it kind of passes through a medium, light bends, but the different colours, the different frequencies of light, some of them bend more than others or refract more than others. And because the colour blue light refracts more than other colours, sunlight passing through the atmosphere causes refraction, and because blue light refracts more than other colours of light, that is why the sky appears to be blue. So we have an observation the sky is blue, but also we can apply a set of known principles taken from physics about the behaviour of light, and we can use that then to come up with an explanation of why the sky is blue. That's what we mean by theory. And without theory, there is no understanding. There are just a bunch of facts without any understanding. So again, yeah, we're not concerned with biology, we're not concerned with physics, but it's exactly the same principle. We make observations in international relations. So we watch the news, we look at the current events which are occurring. But again, without a framework for explanation, none of that really means a lot, in the sense that we don't understand. We know that certain things are happening, but we don't necessarily know why. We can't necessarily explain why these events are the way that they are. In order to make sense of international relations, we need to develop a theory, a framework for understanding based on general principles. So basically, by observing the world, we observe, what are the main features of world politics. What are the interesting things that we need to observe? What are the key phenomena, the key recurring phenomena in international relations? And then we need to try to develop an explanation for why these phenomena occur and recur. And that is the basis for development of international relations theory. And again, once we have a theory, we can go back and we can compare it to current events and to changing events over time, and we can test whether or not the theory holds up. Does the theory continue to explain what we are observing? Does it have predictive power? Because again, if the theory is sound, it ought to be able to not just explain what is happening today, but to a certain extent, it also ought to be able to help us to predict what might happen in the future. So once we have our theory of international relations, we can then test that theory by continuing to compare it to our observations of current events. The thing is, though, unlike biology or physics, there is no single universally accepted theory of international relations. You won't find a biologist who doesn't accept the theory of evolution, for example. It's kind of a fundamental underpinning of biology as the discipline is currently understood today. So you aren't going to find a biologist who doesn't accept the theory of evolution. But in international relations, it's not quite like that, because although we have theories, we have frameworks for explanation, we don't have consensus. We have instead a number of different kind of competing theories. And the reason for that, basically at a fundamental level, the reason for that is that theorists, international relations theorists, are starting from different points, i.e., they don't necessarily agree on which features of world politics are the most important. Again, the starting point for theory is to identify, okay, what are the key phenomena? We watch the news, what's happening in the world, not just today, but what happened yesterday and last year and 10 years ago and over the last century. What are the key features of world politics? What are the key things that are happening? And the thing is, different theorists identify different things as being important. And that's part of the reason why we end up with a bunch of different theories. So, theories are kind of like maps. if you draw a map, the things that you mark on that map reflect the things that you consider to be important. And again, a map is a bit like a theory. A theory is a simplification of reality. A theory doesn't describe every last detail of reality, because if it did that, then it would just be a description of reality. It wouldn't have any power of explanation. A theory is useful precisely because it simplifies and makes comprehensible the observable reality. So in the same way, a map is kind of it's not a detailed drawing of every single feature of the landscape. Instead, a map is kind of a simplified diagram that marks out the key things that the map creator thinks are important, and all of the details are left out in order to present a clear picture, to focus on the things that we want to focus on. Here we have a map of the London Underground, or at least part of the London Underground. And we can see that this map is very much a simplification of reality. Much of the detail that exists in the real world is left out. Why? Because that detail is not necessary. We don't need that level of detail, but also it would be distracting. So the map is simplified, it focuses on the key things, the key information that we need in order to navigate the London Underground, in order to get around. So the map is simplified to fulfill its purpose better. And theory works in a very similar way. Theory is a simplification of reality that highlights the big and important key features and doesn't necessarily concern itself with superfluous detail, which will be a distraction from the main points. So again, on this map, it's kind of written from the perspective, or it's drawn from the perspective that we are interested in the London Underground. And so it focuses on those features. It focuses on the lines, on the stations. There's some basic access information there. It doesn't mark other things on the landscape. So things like roads or banks or shops or car parks or public toilets, or telephone boxes or trees or lampposts. Those are not marked on the map. They are there in reality, but we are assuming that those things for our purposes are not important. Those are not the things that we care about. These are not the things that we need to focus on. So the map only marks the things which are important to a user of the London Underground. And in order to make the map as usable as possible, it simplifies as much as possible. So again, this map is drawn for the purpose of understanding the London Underground. A map drawn for a different reason would show different things. So here's another map of London that shows some of the main markets in the city. So again, it contains some of the same information as the previous map. So the tube stations are marked on the map, but it contains much less detail about the tube network. On the other hand, it does show the major roads. The major roads are marked on the map. Why? Because again, it's a different type of map. It's for a different purpose. It's primarily aiming to show the markets and where they are located in relation to the main means of transport. So in relation to the tube stations, but also in relation to the roads. So because it's serving a different purpose to the previous map, it looks different, and the level of detail is different, and it shows different things. So here's a map of London that shows restaurants, and again, it shows those features that are considered to be most important for its purpose. It shows those features which might be relevant to someone interested in finding good restaurants. So once again, it looks substantially different to the previous two maps because it has a different purpose. Once again, the point I'm trying to make here is that theories work in a similar way. So there are, as we've already mentioned, there are multiple different perspectives on IR. There is not one single universally accepted theory of IR. There are multiple different theoretical paradigms on IR. And each different theory of IR puts different things on its map, depending on what those theorists consider to be important. So for those theorists who consider states to be the most important thing, they are going to emphasize the state-centric nature of the international system as they see it. But other theorists might consider other aspects of global politics to be more important, aspects like economics or class or gender and so on. So theorists focus in on a few key features of the international system, those features that they consider to be the most important ones, and use those to construct a simplified model of the world which can be used to analyse events. And that's essentially what the IR theories are. So in constructing a theory of international relations, our starting point is to consider which features of global politics are the ones that matter. So is it all about states? Is it just about international relations? Or are organisations important? Or is IR about economics? Or is it about military security issues? Or is it about inequalities? Is it about gender? Is it about class? Which are the important features of world politics that we need to look at? And the answers that we give to those questions will dictate what our IR theory looks like. So just to recap very briefly on what we said in the previous section. So we said that a theory is a simplified model of reality. So a theory of IR is basically a simplification of global politics, a simplified model of global politics. And the purpose of theory is to provide a framework for explanation and for understanding. The starting point for developing a theory of IR, the very first thing we need to do is to decide which features and which phenomena in world politics are the most important. What are the things that we need to concentrate on in building our theory? However, different international relations scholars disagree on this. And as a result of that, there is no one single universally accepted theory of IR. Instead, there are multiple competing theoretical paradigms which focus on different things and different aspects of global politics. So hopefully this video has started to clarify what international relations theory is and why we need it. The next video will go on to start to look at the development of IR theory over the last 100 years or so, and explain how the story of IR theory and the development of IR theory is really the story of international relations itself as an academic discipline. Further videos after that will go on to start to look at the individual theoretical paradigms in more detail. Once again, if you found this video useful, then please like and subscribe, and of course if you have any comments, then please add those in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.